very, very rarely change trend.
Yeah, for sure. Right, so we're going to get into all the data of what's happened in the last few days. But before we do, just before we jumped on this call, you were saying that you think there's a lot of people out there that don't fully understand what it is that you actually do. So do you want to start there?
Yes. And I'm the first one, right? I don't understand what I do. The first thing is that this is the world of studying Bitcoin's on-chain data it's new. Very, very few people have gone down this rabbit hole, and it's fascinating. I love it, right? So my background is tunnel engineering. I used to design very, very large holes in the ground, essentially. Lots of risk, lots of probability, lots of big numbers. On-chain data and markets in general are full of uncertainty. You never have a complete picture of any market at any time ever. But on-chain data is really interesting because you can see the UTXO set. You can see how the UTXO set changes. Most of that information is useless, right? And I say it all the time, whale data, stop looking at it. Exchange data, unless you're doing algorithmic trading, stop looking at it. It's just not useful. It's so noisy. But there are sectors of on-chain data that are super, super useful. For example, at the end of the day, what is the UTXO set? It's us. It's every single Bitcoiner who's listening to this. If you have ever transacted on-chain, you have imprinted information into that UTXO. What the price was that you acquired it. Doesn't matter if you bought it at this price and withdrew it 2 days later, it was doesn't matter. What's your cost basis? How long have you held it for? How much profit are you in? How much loss are you in? How many of your coins are in profit or loss? It's looking at this big thing in aggregate, and people are herd behavior, right? Even though we're all Bitcoiners and we're all thinking about the world differently, a lot of us still sell when the market goes up and a lot of us still buy when the market goes down. That's the Bitcoiner behavior pattern. Speculators do the opposite. They buy on the way up, right? And they sell on the way down because they panic. So what we're doing with on-chain data, we're trying to just look at the human behavior patterns, which are extremely relatable. They happen across time and space. They've been happening forever. So long as human beings trade markets and we're greedy, which is going to always be true, we continue to have the same behavior patterns. And I also think a lot of people get what I do confused with the likes of chain analysis. So there's two worlds of on-chain analysis. The first one is what you'll generally hear when we say on-chain analysis is we're going to look at the behavior patterns. We're looking at mean reversion models. We're using cost basis to understand points of concentration, when too many people have bought too many coins at too high of a price. Then there's forensics. This is what the chain analysis do. And a lot of people recently been like, why didn't you see FTX blowing up? It's like, because it's not my job to look for fraud, mate. Like, that's why I didn't see FTX, because I wasn't looking for it. It's not my job. But Chainalysis, who I believe was an investor or was associated with FTX, or FTX invested in them, their job is to look for fraud. That's their job, right? So they're two different buckets. In many ways, it's like being a behavioral economist. And then you got the forensics who get all their contracts from governments to chase individuals around the internet. Two separate fields. Really important to just make that distinction.
Yeah, very separate. I'm bullish check on chain. I'm very bearish Chainalysis.
Yeah, me too. And the other thing that's kind of important is that on-chain analysis is only a fraction of what I use, right? What's really interesting about Bitcoin, just markets in general, is how transparent they are. And actually, I was talking to my colleague at Glassnode the other day, and he was basically stitching together, how do you tell this story of what this data is? If you are trading Tesla or whatever on the NASDAQ, the exchange can see everyone's cost basis. The exchange can see the buying and the selling and the profit and the loss, but they never aggregate and actually use that data. And then behind the scenes, there's a clearinghouse, right? As stocks change and move and settle and money moves between different accounts. The Bitcoin blockchain is that settlement account. When people buy and DCA and sell, and 80% of all on-chain volume is usually associated with coins going in or out of exchange, right? So you're looking at 80% of all movement is probably holding some kind of information. And what we're basically doing is taking that information, taking the spot data, taking the derivatives data, futures and options, the ETFs. We've got all these different subsets of the market. And my job is to look at the patterns in each one. And more often than not, the ETFs tell me the same story as the on-chain. The on-chain tells me the same story as the futures. I've got various metrics that are completely separate markets, but they tell the exact same story just from a different perspective. So it's like a survey. I'm surveying populations and forming a, relatively cohesive story to get a decent read on what's going on.
And before we actually get into your analysis, how much attention do you pay to like the macro outlook as well?
Yeah, so I don't write too much. Occasionally I'll write about the macro, but I think there's a lot of people who cover that quite well. But what I do, I mean, if you showed my podcast, like my weekly podcast list to any of my friends, are like, you've listened to that? Like it's the driest shit you've ever heard. But I'll listen.
What Bitcoin did.
What Bitcoin did. I mean, who the hell wants to listen to this? But basically, like in my spare time, right, my podcast diet is macro, 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 because it's the biggest puzzle that there is, right? How the world ticks over. And so for me, that's personally fascinating. So whilst I don't explicitly write about it that often, sometimes I'll include it because it's sometimes really important. But generally speaking, I kind of process that in the background. But we were talking before we hit record that the Bitcoin is the index. So much of this information is being baked into this fire alarm, and it tells us the story of what's going on in macro more often than it doesn't. So in a way, I study macro in the background, and then Bitcoin is how I express that view because I think it expresses that